March 25, 1911, a beautiful Saturday in Greenwich Village. Passers-by look up, expecting to see a celebration at the top of the Asch building. Instead, they see what looks like bundles of fabric being tossed from the windows. But the fabric is screaming. One reporter, William Gunn Shepherd, noted that the bundles hit the pavement with a sound like no other. A thud more horrible than description can picture. It wasn't fabric. It was the young women of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory choosing the sidewalk over the furnace. But the real horror isn't the fire. It's the key that stayed turned in the lock, the key that turned independence into a tomb. Before we unseal this archive, subscribe to Silent Archive for more forgotten history, and comment "Next Dark History" below to cast your vote for our next investigation. In 1911, the shirtwaist was the uniform of the modern woman, a symbol of independence. Max Planck and Isaac Harris, the Shirtwaist Kings, were the titans of this industry. They were the masters of the Asch building. But their fireproof marvel was a gendered trap. 500 souls inside a room filled with oily rags and wicker baskets. At 4:40 p.m., a single match was dropped. Within 3 minutes, the 8th floor was a kiln. It rained fire. File 02, The Descent. On the 9th floor, 240 workers scrambled. They ran to the Washington Place stairs and turned the knob. It wouldn't budge. To prevent theft, the masters had locked the exit. Independence had become a tomb. Meet Margaret Schwartz. She was seen by her friends clutching the locked door on the 9th floor. Her fingernails clawed at the wood until the smoke took her. We know this because of the trial transcripts. Documents that survived when she didn't. When firefighters finally breached that locked door, they found a pile of bodies 6 feet high, an entire floor of souls silenced by a key. The silent witness isn't just a person, it's the charred remains of that door, a testament to a $3 blouse being worth more than a human life. But the horror didn't end with the fire. Next, we unseal File 04, The Cover-Up, a masterclass in gaslighting that protected the Shirtwaist Kings. Max Steuer, a predatory defense lawyer, was about to turn the victim's grief into a weapon. The archive reveals a trial where justice was the final casualty. To understand the fire, we must understand the world that built the Asch building. New York in 1911 was a city of soaring ambitions and crushing poverty. The shirtwaist was more than a blouse. It was the engine of a global fashion empire, and Max Planck and Isaac Harris were its kings. But this empire was built on a foundation of hidden dangers. While the world looked at the rising skyline, they ignored the technological gap, where buildings reached the 10th floor, but the fire department's ladders only reached the 6th. Technology had scaled upward, but safety equipment remained grounded in the 19th century. File 04, The Cover-Up. The aftermath of the fire was a masterclass in gaslighting. Max Planck and Isaac Harris were charged with manslaughter, but the trial that followed was a mockery of justice. Their lead defense attorney, Max Steuer, used predatory tactics to dismantle the survivors on the stand. He mocked their accents, their grief, and their memory, forcing them to repeat harrowing testimony until it sounded rehearsed to the jury of businessmen. To the world, the Asch building was a tomb. To the courtroom, it was a debate over property rights and the cost of doing business. The Shirtwaist Kings weren't just escaping prison, they were preparing to collect. The archive reveals a chilling financial reality. Planck and Harris actually made a profit of roughly $60,000 from insurance payouts after the fire. They collected $445 in insurance for every worker lost. In the civil suit that followed, the families of the victims received only $75. A human life was worth less than a luxury carriage. While the families mourned in the tenements of the Lower East Side, the masters walked free, their wealth secured by the very tragedy that had silenced their workers. It was the ultimate betrayal of the American dream, locked inside a furnace and sold for parts. But the 146 lives lost that day didn't just vanish into ash. Their deaths birthed the American labor laws we take for granted today. The horror of the Triangle Fire sparked a revolution. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union gained global traction. and the Sullivan-Hoey fire prevention law was written in the blood of those who fell. This legacy is our archive's final file. Today, the Asch building still stands as part of NYU. Students walk the halls where the young women once scrambled for their lives. On certain March evenings, it's said you can still hear the jiggling of a doorknob that refuses to open, a reminder of the key that stayed turned in the lock. The American dream didn't just go up in flames. It was locked inside and left to burn so that we might learn to never turn the key again. Before we close this archive, subscribe for more forgotten history and cast your vote in the comments. What dark history should we unseal next? The archive remains open for those who dare to look. Comment "Next Dark History" below and help us choose our next investigation. The past is never truly silent. It's just waiting to be heard. Subscribe to Silent Archive. While New York burned in 1911, the fire was not the first spark of resistance. 2 years earlier, the uprising of the 20,000 had already seen thousands of immigrant women take to the streets, demanding dignity in the face of industrial greed. This wasn't just a local dispute. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union was gaining traction globally. From London to St. Petersburg, the cry for labor reform was echoing across the oceans. The Triangle Fire became the tipping point. It turned a domestic tragedy into a global rallying cry. The world was watching as New York's sweatshops became the front line of a worldwide revolution for the common worker. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union wasn't just an organization, it was a lifeline. In the months following the fire, membership didn't just grow, it exploded. Workers who once lived in fear of the locked door now held the key to their own future. They fought for the Sullivan-Hoey fire prevention law. This wasn't just ink on paper, it was a piece of legislation written in the very ash of the Asch building, mandating the safety standards that would eventually become the norm. But the struggle remained global. In Europe, garment workers from London to Berlin were taking note of the New York tragedy. They used the horror of the Triangle Fire as a shield against their own industrial masters, demanding protections that crossed borders. The archive reveals a world where the common worker was no longer silent. While the fire raged on the upper floors, a heroic struggle was unfolding in the building's shafts. Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortillalo, the young elevator operators, became the workers' only hope. As the building became a furnace, they drove their cars into the smoke. They made 3 frantic trips, saving dozens of lives, until the intense heat began to warp the iron rails. The elevators, meant for efficiency, were now the only escape from an industrial tomb. In a final act of desperation, some girls jumped into the open shafts, landing on the roof of the cars and crushing those inside. It was a choice between a vertical grave or a horizontal furnace, a nightmare fueled by the master's neglect. Rose Friedman, the last survivor, remembered the executive elevator, the one reserved for the bosses. She followed their trail to the roof, living to be 107. She never forgot that while the bosses escaped, the workers faced the locked door. Before the smoke and the sirens, there was the neighborhood. The Lower East Side was the most densely populated place on Earth, a labyrinth of brick and sweat where the American dream was often measured in square inches. To the factory owners, they were fabric cutters and seamstresses. But the archive reminds us they were daughters, sisters, and mothers. New arrivals with dreams as vast as the ocean they had just crossed. In these tenements, 15 people might share a single room. They worked 12-hour days at the factory, then returned home to work more. The shirtwaist wasn't just their product, it was their ticket out of the shadows. But as we unseal File 06, we'll see how that dream was systematically exploited. The archive reveals a world where independence was promised, but a bolt was always waiting. Subscribe to Silent Archive. File 06, The Gendered Trap. The locked doors of the Asch building weren't just a safety violation, they were a symptom of deep-seated social distrust. To the masters, these women were potential thieves. In 1911, the shirtwaist was a symbol of the modern, independent woman. But inside the factory, it was a uniform of surveillance. Owners feared the workers would steal fabric scraps or take unauthorized breaks. They locked the exits to protect their property, valuing lace and thread over human life. This culture of control turned a workplace into a kiln. The bolt was a silent guard that no one could escape. The archive reveals that the real trap wasn't just the fire, it was the distrust that had been brewing for years. In 1911, New York was reaching for the heavens. But while technology scaled buildings upward, safety equipment remained grounded in the 19th century. The Asch building was a marvel, built on a foundation of neglect. The FDNY was the city's pride, but they fought a 20th century fire with 19th century tools. Their most advanced ladders only reached the 6th floor. Above them, the workers were beyond the reach of salvation. Water streams turned into mist before hitting the windows. The gap between the ladder's end and the factory floor was 100 feet of fire and smoke. It was a space where the American dream was simply out of reach. The archive reveals that the tragedy wasn't just a failure of locks, but a failure of foresight. The archive preserves more than just dates and laws. It preserves the sounds of history. Meet William Gunn Shepard, a reporter who stood on the sidewalk that Saturday. He didn't just see the fire, he heard it. Shepard wrote, "I learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk, a rhythmic, relentless percussion of loss. To those below, it looked like bundles of fabric were falling from the windows. But as the thuds continued, the city realized the fabric was screaming. It was the sound of the American dream hitting the pavement." The archive reveals a day that changed the soul of New York. In December 1911, the eyes of the world turned to a Manhattan courtroom. Max Blank and Isaac Harris were on trial for manslaughter. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the quiet desperation of survivors seeking justice. Among the witnesses was Kate Alterman. She was a survivor of the 9th floor, a young woman tasked with speaking for the 146 who could no longer speak for themselves. Her testimony would become the heart of the prosecution's case. Kate described the scene at the Washington Place door. She spoke of the smoke, the heat, and the locked handle that refused to yield. It was a harrowing account of a nightmare that the masters claimed never happened. But defense attorney Max Steuer was waiting. Max Steuer wasn't just a lawyer. He was a master of psychological warfare. His target was Kate Alterman. He didn't challenge the facts of the fire, he challenged the soul of the survivor. Steuer forced Kate to repeat her harrowing account of the 9th floor, word for word, again and again. He was looking for a pattern, but not the kind you'd expect. He wanted the jury to see her memory as a script. To the jury, her consistency wasn't proof of truth. Steuer claimed it was proof of a rehearsal. He painted her trauma as a performance, turning her grief into a weapon against her. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. The archive reveals a trial where the truth was the final casualty. The archive isn't just a list of numbers, it's a list of names. Of the 146 souls lost, nearly half were teenagers, new arrivals who had barely begun their lives. Girls like Rosaria and Lucia Maltese, just 14 and 20 years old. They worked side by side with their mother, Catherine. In the 1911 garment industry, youth was a resource to be consumed, not protected. These were the daughters of the Lower East Side. They came for the promise of a future, but found themselves trapped in a system that valued their output more than their safety. The archive records their ages, but it cannot record their lost potential. In our next file, we unseal the families left behind and the empty chairs in the tenements. Subscribe to Silent Archive and help us remember the 146. The archive remains open.